Rare Indian fabric. The destruction of the world's finest fabric. Imagine a piece of fabric fitting inside the ring. Not a few meters. A full 50 meters. As thin as a thread, as light as air. It's as if you're touching not a physical object, but the mist floating on a river in the early morning hours. Light passes through it, but this transparency doesn't come from silk. It comes from cotton. This is not a fairy tale. This is a description of a fabric recorded in history, described with astonishment by travelers, and meticulously preserved in the palaces of emperors. Dhaka muslin. Wrapped in mummies of Egyptian pharaohs. A luxury praised by Roman senators. The only garment adopted by the Mongol emperors. What Marie Antoinette whispered in the Parisian salons. Jane Austen spoke of it with admiration in her letters. This fabric was the finest cotton fabric the world had ever known. And their names were like poetry: Baft Hawa, weaving wind. Abravan, flowing water. Shabnam, dewdrop. These names described not just a fabric, but a structure of that fabric that transcended physical boundaries, a structure that was almost imperceptible to the touch. And this miraculous fabric was destroyed, deliberately, systematically, for profit. This is the story of that extinction. But it is also the story of one of the greatest economic robberies in the world. How a nation's centuries-old labor, knowledge, and identity were stolen. India's Golden Age. Before the British East India Company ventured out to sea, in the early 17th century, India was the undisputed center of textile production in the world. This is not an exaggeration, it was an objective fact derived from the data of the time, recorded by European merchants in their own records. Indian textiles surpassed the spice trade to become the leading exporter to Europe between the 17th and 18th centuries. Records of the Dutch East India Company reveal that purchases from Bengal accounted 40% of its total Asian imports. British and Dutch companies together purchased more than 1 million pieces of Indian fabric every year. Dhaka was home to over 180,000 weavers. Merchants from Persia, Portugal, and the Netherlands stayed in large caravanserais along the river. Dhaka, whose population reached its peak of about 1 million during the Mongol period, was known as the Venice of the East. Mongolian Bengal alone produced approximately 14% of the world economy. And at the heart of this wealth, cotton. More precisely, it's a fabric made from cotton, which cannot be produced anywhere else in the world. The French merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier wrote in the 17th century, "This fabric is so soft and fine that it feels imperceptible against the body." In the 9th century, the Arab merchant Suleiman recounted the following. "A fabric is made in this country that has no equal anywhere else. It is such a fine and delicate material that a dress made from it could be threaded through the hole of a ring stone." This was no exaggeration. Records show that the length of a single strand exceeded 1,000 yards, and the number of strands reached 2,425. Considering that even with today's most advanced technology, only 500 to 600 threads can be achieved, this figure represents not only a historical achievement but also the miracle of a lost civilization. Each type of muslin had its own name: mulbuz kaz, wearable only by the emperor; Juna, like tulle; Baft Hawa, woven for the wind. Each one was, in itself, the name of a work of art. And these works of art were coming not only from Dhaka, they were also from Banaras, Malwa, and Surat. From all corners of India, unique patterns and techniques were dressing much of the world. But this era would come to an end. And that end came not with weapons, but with decrees, edicts, and steam. East India Company. From merchant to ruler. On December 31, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter granting a group of English merchants the privilege of trading in the East India. Thus, the British East India Company was born. Her initial intention was simple: to get a share of India's wealth. The company was initially just a trading organization. There was enormous demand for Indian fabrics in Europe. The company was a middleman meeting this demand. But this picture began to change within the first half-century. The company was strengthening its trade deployments while also increasing its military presence. She built forts in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Bengal. She acquired land rights by signing agreements with local authorities. And so came the crucial crossroads: to remain a merchant or to become a ruler. June 23, 1757, Plassey village, banks of the Bhagirathi River. Suraj-ud-Dowla, the last independent Nava of Bengal, was betrayed by his own commander. The company army of 3,000 men under the command of Robert Clive crushed the 50,000-strong Navabian army in 11 hours. Suraj-ud-Dowla escaped, was captured, and killed. The Battle of Plassey changed everything. The company was no longer a trading organization, but the true ruler of Bengal. In 1765, the authority to collect taxes in Bengal and Bihar was formally transferred to the company. This was the moment when exploitation took on a new dimension. Commercial profits were no longer enough. Land revenues would also flow into the company's coffers. Bengal's treasures, accumulated over centuries, began to flow towards London. The enslavement of weavers. The deepest and most lasting wound of the Battle of Plassey was not inflicted on the battlefield. It was struck at the weaving looms. When the company took control of Bengal, one of its first actions was to bring the weaving network under its own control. Until then, Indian weavers had relatively freer freedom. They were able to sell goods to multiple buyers, negotiate prices, and set their own production conditions. The company ended this freedom in one fell swoop. It eliminated local intermediaries and rebuilt the system through its own appointed agents. These agents were giving advances to the weavers. But these advances were not support, but a noose. A weaver who accepted the advance payment was now obligated to sell only to the company. The company set the price, usually below cost. They had no right to refuse. William Bolts, who traveled through Bengal in 1772, wrote, "Indian weavers are bound by contracts imposed by company agents. They cannot sell their goods to anyone else." Oppression, beatings, imprisonment, and forced labor — these were the common methods of the time. In her 1902 work, Romesh Chunder Dutt documents that weavers at that time received wages insufficient to provide even a full meal a day. Some, drowning in debt, abandoned their stalls. Others fled their villages. Traditional trades, passed down from their ancestors, disappeared within a generation. Lord Clive himself admitted in 1765, "It will long be a disgrace to England that agents acting on behalf of company officials have opened a source of tyranny and oppression." But this admission changed nothing. Calico laws, Parliament's trade weapon. While the East India Company was buying cloth from India and selling it to Europe, another front was opening in Britain. The success of Indian cloth in England had horrified local wool and silk merchants. By the end of the 17th century, Indian cottons had created an absolute craze in English markets. It was colorful, durable, washable, and much cheaper than English wool. women have started to prefer fabrics with Indian prints. This situation directly threatened the livelihoods of local weavers. In 1697, an angry mob attacked the East India Company building in London. Women wearing calico were attacked in the streets. Some had acid thrown on their clothes, others had their garments torn. Thousands of signed petitions poured into Parliament, and Parliament took action. The first Calico Act was passed in 1700. It prohibited the import of dyed and printed Indian cotton fabrics. But smuggling became widespread. A second, more comprehensive law was introduced in 1721. This time, the sale of both imported and domestically produced cotton fabrics was prohibited. Wearing Indian fabric was now a crime punishable by a fine. It's important to recognize the irony here. While the British were trying to suppress Indian textiles in India, they were simultaneously banning them in their own country. But the two laws had different purposes. The first was to open the Indian market to British products, and the second was to protect and expand its own cotton industry. When the laws were repealed in 1774, British manufacturers had strengthened their position in a protected environment, and the machinery of the Industrial Revolution was about to propel them to a point where they could compete with Indian textiles. The Industrial Revolution and the greatest price weapon in history. James Hargreaves invented the spinning machine in 1764. Richard Arkwright developed the water-powered frame in 1769. Edmund Cartwright built the steam-powered weaving loom in 1785. And when these inventions came together, world textile production reached the greatest turning point in its history. British factories could now complete in weeks what would have taken a weaver years to do, producing goods faster and more cheaply. In the early 1800s, factory-made textiles from England were being sold at a tenth of the price of hand-woven textiles from India. But it's important to know that even these machines couldn't initially compete with the quality of Indian fabric. History clearly shows this. English fabric was not as fine as Indian calico. What did they do when they couldn't compete? They knocked on the government's door. In 1813, the import tax on cotton fabric from India reached 85%. When India wanted to sell its textiles to the British market, it had to pay taxes almost double the value of the textiles. On the other hand, British factory-made fabrics entered the Indian market with a 3.5% tariff. This tax asymmetry was one of the greatest trade weapons in history. Despite its superior qualities, Indian fabric has become unable to compete in the market. And when the numbers started speaking, the tragedy of history came to light. Between 1800 and 1860, textile exports from India fell by 98%. During the same period, textile imports from Britain to India increased 6,300-fold. To read these numbers solely as economic data would be to miss the drama they embody. These figures meant that the number of weavers in Dhaka, which was 180,000, had fallen to tens of thousands. These numbers meant that weaving knowledge, passed down from generation to generation, was disappearing in a single generation. These figures meant that Bengal's share of the world textile trade, which was 25%, had fallen to 2% over the decades. The death of a city. In 1640, Dhaka's population was approximately 200,000. The same figure was true in 1786, and again in 1800. But by the 1830s, that number had been halved. An Anglican bishop who visited the region in 1824 described Dhaka as a city of great ruin. The city was dead. In 1800, Dhaka's annual muslin production was worth approximately 26 lakh rupees. Within a few decades, this figure had virtually dropped to zero. Millions of weavers lost their jobs. Some were forced to become agricultural laborers, Others died without ever being able to do the work they had done with their hands for centuries. Was this massive collapse solely a result of market competition? The company's policies were much more direct and precise. A tax of 75% was imposed on cotton exports from Bengal. Fabrics produced in Bengal sometimes faced tariff barriers exceeding 100% when trying to enter the British market. When the company's trade monopoly was abolished in 1813, Manchester's factory owners, removing every obstacle in their way, directly seized the Indian market. Cheap British fabrics, with near-zero tariffs, have flooded Indian markets. India, previously an exporter, has suddenly become the world's largest textile importer. The disappearance of Phuti Karpas. The final, and perhaps most striking factor in the disappearance of Dhaka muslin was not found in the tax records, it lay in the soil itself. Muslin required an exceptionally fine yarn for weaving. Producing this yarn required cotton that grows in only one place in the world, Phuti Karpas. This plant grew only 12 miles southeast of Dhaka, on the banks of the Meghna River. It did not yield the same quality in any other soil or climate. Its fibers were extraordinarily fine. Unlike ordinary cotton, when wet in the waters of the Meghna, instead of swelling and falling apart, they twisted and strengthened. This allowed for the spinning of such a fine thread that even modern machine technology cannot match it. And British colonial agricultural policies killed this miraculous plant. The company restructured agriculture in Bengal. Tea, jute, indigo dye, these were the raw materials needed by British industry. Bengali farmers were directed, sometimes forced, to grow these crops. Phuti Karpas fields were gradually transformed into jute fields. By the end of the 19th century, Phuti Karpas no longer grew along the Meghna coast. The plant had become extinct. And along with the plant, the knowledge, the craft, the culture that existed with that plant also disappeared. Launched in 2013, the Bengal Muslin Project aimed to find a closely related seed by analyzing the plant's DNA. Years of research have led to the discovery of a plant that is 70% similar to Phuti Karpas. Cultivation was carried out on the Meghna coast, and the first harvest took place in 2015. But the number of threads obtained couldn't exceed 300, about 1/5 of the original muslin. The knowledge was dead. When something physical disappears, you can replace it with something else. But once that knowledge, passed down through generations, known not just by the hands but by the whole body, is lost, it can take centuries to bring it back. Corporate robbery. Wealth flow theory. In the late 19th century, Indian intellectuals began to develop concepts to describe what was happening. The most comprehensive was the flow of wealth theory, put forward by Dadabhai Naoroji in 1867. Naoroji argued that India was systematically deprived of its own resources during the colonial period. According to their calculations, the total amount of wealth transferred from India to England between 1757 and 1947 exceeded £1 billion. Some historians estimate that, with today's purchasing power, this figure would approach $10 trillion. The mechanism was simple but implicit. The company used Bengal's tax revenues to buy goods produced in India and export them to Europe. In other words, the taxes paid by the Indians were paying for the goods taken from their land. India received neither gold nor any other compensation. It was depleting its own treasury. Romesh Chunder Dutt's meticulous research clearly revealed this transformation. India was transformed from a producer exporting manufactured goods to a colony exporting raw materials. India's share of world industrial production had fallen from approximately 25% at the beginning of the 18th century to 2% by 1900. A 12.5-fold decrease in 1 century. During the same period, Britain's share increased from 1% to 18%. When these two figures are read together, there is an undeniable transfer. India's economic capacity was transferred to Britain. Legend and reality. The story of finger cutting. The most common folktale describing the collapse of India's textile industry is the story of finger cutting. It's a widely known story. British authorities had the thumbs of Dhaka's most skilled muslin weavers cut off so they could never produce that fine fabric again. This story creates an extremely powerful image, and it's truly controversial among historians. There is no direct, documented source to support the claim. However, it would be wrong to dismiss this story entirely. William Bolt's 1772 report states that weavers were subdued through physical force. Another document describes how weavers cut off their own thumbs to avoid forced labor, meaning the act was committed by the weavers themselves, out of desperation, not the company. In historical writing, such narratives often become figurative representations of a real horror. A physical finger may not have been cut off, but the fact that thousands of weavers were prevented from working, forced into other professions, and subjected to economic hardship, these things are real and documented. Perhaps popular memory chose that sharp and terrifying symbol to embody this reality. Regardless, it is possible to say this: while physical finger cutting may not be proven, the economic finger cutting practiced by British colonial policy is evident in the figures and documents. The Bengal Famines, a nation in hunger. The collapse of the textile industry affected Bengal not only economically but also biologically. The first major famine in the company's administration ravaged Bengal in 1769 to 1770. For centuries, the villagers had made their living through weaving and trade, but suddenly they had become people with neither work nor income. Romesh Chunder Dutt wrote the following. In early 1769, high prices foreshadowed an impending famine, but land tax was being collected more harshly than ever. Approximately one-third of Bengal's population, that is, 10 million people, lost their lives in this famine. During times of famine, company agents monopolized grain, stockpiled it, and sold it at high prices to profit from the disaster. The famine of 1770 marked the effective end of Bengal's muslin weaving tradition. With many master craftsmen losing their lives in that famine, the knowledge passed down through generations was buried with them. The Great Famine that struck Bengal in 1943, in the midst of World War II, was the final link in this tragic legacy. Nearly 3 million people lost their lives. Historians document that the Churchill government's largely refusal to grant aid and food requests from India deepened the famine. This was the legacy of colonialism, a policy of developing raw materials for profit rather than infrastructure to sustain people. Gandhi's spinning wheel and the symbol of resistance. A barricade was erected at the beginning of the century, but this time not with rifles, but with a spinning wheel. Mohandas Gandhi transformed the issue of reviving indigenous textile production into a political action. The Swadeshi movement, meaning products of our own land movement, advocated boycotting British goods and promoting their own handmade fabrics, khadi. Gandhi's famous photograph at the spinning wheel was not just an image of a moment, it was a consciously chosen symbol. The message, "Spin your own yarn, weave your own fabric," was not a production method, it was a political manifesto. Gandhi said, "Britain prevented us from wearing the cloth we wove ourselves. We must weave our own freedom with our own spinning wheel." This spinning wheel was incorporated into the flag of the Indian National Congress, and eventually the Ashoka wheel found its place on the flag of independent India. A weaving tool had become a symbol of a nation. Swadeshi's economic impact was limited. It did not dramatically disrupt British textile production. But its cultural and political impact is undeniable. It reminded people that they have the capacity to build their own futures. And when India declared its independence on August 15, 1947, the sound of that spinning wheel could still echo in the distance. Universal lessons from the mirror of history. The collapse of the Indian textile industry may seem like a story from a distant land, dating back a few centuries. But the lessons within it remain relevant for any economy and any era. Firstly, superiority does not mean immunity. India produced the world's finest fabric of the highest quality. This superiority had been earned and maintained for decades. But price imbalances, artificial barriers created by tariffs, and policies that legally weakened competition rendered this dominance economically meaningless. Quality alone is not enough. It is also necessary to have the power to shape market conditions. Secondly, the trap of exporting raw materials still holds true. India shipped its cotton in its raw form to England and received it back processed in Manchester's factories. This trap persists in many developing economies today, in various forms. At each stage, the added value remains with the owner of the production chain. Thirdly, recognizing and preparing for technological transformation is vital. The Industrial Revolution had changed the dominance of Indian textiles in the market even before Indian merchants realized it. Today's artificial intelligence and automation revolutions are happening with similar speed and scope. Fourth, once information is lost, it is extremely difficult to recover. When the Phuti Karpas species becomes extinct, and the human knowledge that accompanied it also vanishes, it could take centuries to bring it back, no matter how much money or willpower is spent. Traditional knowledge is not a backup, but a living entity that must be actively preserved. And fifth, this story shows us how intertwined state sovereignty is with economic conditions. Siraj-ud-Daula's defeat was not only a military defeat, it also meant Bengal lost its sovereignty over its own trade. And this loss laid the groundwork for every disaster that followed. Conclusion: the weaving follows the wind. Several pieces of Dhaka muslin are on display in the London collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. As we bend down to examine these fabrics behind the glass, it is possible to see the miraculous thread that young women spun with their fingers centuries ago on the banks of the Meghna River in the early morning hours as the dew fell. But every Bangladeshi or Indian who steps into that museum experiences a conflicting feeling in their heart. They are happy that it has been preserved and is on display, but at the same time, they know how that fabric got there. This page of history is neither a pure narrative of victimhood nor a pure document of accusation. The complex reality of human history is not always based on simple good and evil. But when the numbers speak, when the policies are examined, and when people's lives are looked at, a common picture emerges. A people who produce the world's finest fabric have become victims of the crudest policies. This story shares its roots with the tale of the Ottoman Angora goat, the plundering of Africa's resources, and the outflow of Latin America's silver. This is a universal story of how powerful nations transform weakening economies, how they acquire raw materials, seize knowledge, and reshape markets. The seeds of Phuti Karpas are sprouting again on the banks of the Meghna. Young weavers are returning to their looms. Perhaps one day the authentic, silky sheen of genuine Dhaka muslin will be seen again. But first, it's necessary to know the story fully and honestly. Because without understanding what was truly lost, it's impossible to search for it.